So, Bill, welcome to another episode of The Conversation. How the hell are you in the US of A?
Good morning, Grant. I am like most people here, just throwing up our hands and going, what the hell is going to happen next? And please may it not be worse than the day before. So that's how I am.
Well, on that basis, why don't we talk about something we know nothing about?
I would love to do nothing more than talk about something I know nothing about.
Well, let's do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to respond to a listener to the podcast who sent me an email and he said, love you guys. Love what you talk about. Listen to every episode. You've never spoken about landscape photography. Could you do that? And I reached out to you. You said, I don't really know anything about it. I don't, well, maybe I know a little bit about it, but I'm not really sure. I don't really have any kind of leaning towards it that I really enjoy it or like it. So that seems like a good place to start in a turbulent world, doesn't it?
It does, and I think it might be worth maybe talking just a bit about why neither of us has gravitated to that genre particularly.
Okay. Do you want me to go first or do you want to start?
I don't know. I'll start because it'll be over quickly, I think. Which is, setting aside some of the masters of the field, the Ansel Adams, the ones that come to, mind so quickly. A lot of the landscape photography I see now on Instagram, the ones that win magazine contests, the ones that win sort of gallery contests, I find unbelievably boring. Are they pretty pictures? Yes, they are pretty pictures. Do they capture a moment of sun or fog or a bird coming through? Yes, they do. But they don't speak to me on any kind of an emotionally connected level. And in a way, I find them generic in that I can't find the photographer in the picture. I don't know. I get no sense of the shooter from the image. That's number one. Number two is I also find a great, maybe majority of them to be post-produced to within an inch of their life so that they almost look like AI images. And if we're shooting nature, why are we making it look like something else? So that's my 90-second spiel on why I'm not fascinated by landscape photography.
Bill, can I ask you, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Los Angeles.
Okay. What kind of an environment?
So I would say suburban, although I grew up near the beach. So, I don't know how well you know LA, but the beach is obviously gorgeous and there's sunsets and there's cliffs and it's beautiful. And then, back in those days anyway, before the traffic was so terrible, within a half an hour, you could be in mountains, 20 minutes, you could be in mountains and you could go hiking. So it's a big city, but at the time when I grew up, it is very much surrounded by nature.
Okay. That kind of blows one of my theories because I grew up in South London, which is very urban.
Hmm.
And I have no interest whatsoever in nature or wildlife or pretty scenes. I remember being in the Australian outback once and being shown the Southern Cross and sort of thinking, okay, what's next? I'm just not. My brother always says he doesn't go on a walk unless it ends in a coffee. And I kind of, that's my background. I have no interest in nature and I have no interest in space.
So now I live in a small town, high elevation at the foot of the most beautiful mountains. I live in Taos, New Mexico. This is, more or less where Georgia O'Keeffe and a whole host of painters famously decided to move because the light is spectacular. Like, I used to live in Brooklyn, which is, quite urban, and you could barely see the sky. And I am loving being here and being in nature. You know, I take a walk every day in the foothills. And so I think we're coming at this from kind of opposite ends, but meeting in the same place, which is a lack of interest in landscape photography.
Well, it is because now I'm living in the Cotswolds, which is absolutely the center for every pretty photograph of kind of rural England and that whole thing. So, despite those environments, we are still not drawn to landscape photography. And I think picking up on something you said there about the technical post-production of landscape photography, I think that's an element for me, which is also a turnoff. But also, I was thinking about this. And from a UK perspective, and I'd be interested to know what your US perspective is on this, is that there was a real school of landscape photography, kind of a pictorialist response through photographers like Faye Godwin and what's his name? I can't remember his name now. Oh gosh, it's gone right out of my head. Anyway, the idea was that I'll remember, but the idea was that the landscape photograph in black and white was very much about printing. And it was about how beautifully you could create a print, the tones, the mid-tones, the shadow areas, and so forth. And so the landscape photograph very much came about through that passion
Mm.
around the printed artifact. And I think that's where it kind of connects also with the post-produced artifact. Is the landscape photograph kind of the beginning of something to mess around with?
That's interesting. I have not thought about that at all. Um, I guess there might be something else that, and I really hope I'm not sort of putting my foot in it right now, but when I think of most landscape photographers, I think of an older guy with a ton of expensive gear, um, a hobbyist, and part of it's taking the picture, capturing, underline, italics, something, and then spending a lot of time making it look gorgeous. And it feels more like a technical act than an act of spirituality or introspection. And I think what I like in pictures is a little bit more of the latter.
So we're in real dangerous territory, aren't we? Of labeling, because I think at this point we need to define what is landscape photography, because what we're talking about there is a sort of the chocolate box image. But I have the same problem with street photography when people talk to me about street photography. I live on a street which is really quiet and there are no people around, and it would be a really boring street photography. So, do I have to go to New York or do I have to go to London to create strong street photography? Do I
Mhm.
need to go in the UK to the Lake District, or do I need to go up to Scotland, or do you need to go to Yosemite to create landscape photography?
Um, well, this is really such a great question to ask. And I want to read you, and I spoke with a few photographers, as I often do. And one of them, I think, you've just provided a great on-ramp to what he has to say. So his name is Alex Harris, and I'll tell you about him in a minute. But I want to read you the first thing that he wrote to me when I said, "Are you interested in speaking with me about landscape photography?" He said, Walker Evans wrote about loving nature, but not being interested in photographing nature, and definitely not being interested in photographing nature for its beauty alone. Evans was interested in society and moving away from the consciously artistic image. Clearly, Alex wrote to me, that helped shape my approach to landscape photography. And I think some of that will be a little bit more clear when I tell you what our conversation was. But
Well, tell me what your conversation was, because I'm fascinated now, because I think this really aligns with something I think. So I'd love to hear it.
So let me tell you a little bit about Alex. He is a thoughtful, absolutely wonderful photographer with whom I've had the pleasure to collaborate on two big magazine stories recently. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, and his work is at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, among many others. He founded the Center for Documentary Photography at Duke University, and he co-founded and edited Double Take, which was the hugely influential photography magazine some years ago. And he's
Yeah,
published
great magazine.
great magazine. And he's published something like 18 books. So for years, Alex lived and photographed in northern New Mexico, close to where I live now. And during that time, he made this absolutely brilliant and beautiful series of images in which he shot landscapes through the front window of lowriders, which are customized cars that are sort of big in some Hispanic cultures. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will move my head and you can see one of Alex's pictures that hangs in our dining room, which I love. So I asked Alex why he felt that shooting through a car window was the way to capture the landscape. And he told me this. In making photographs of the landscape of northern New Mexico from the perspective of the windshields of lowrider cars, my idea was to get as close as the camera allowed to the way people from a particular place saw and experienced their own landscape. I wanted to make a connection between the interior and exterior world there. My only rule for myself was to make the photograph in landscape the person drove through or in a village where they lived. In Havana, Cuba, I used the same device of seeing the landscape through a car in order to create a different metaphor than I had in New Mexico. The predominant cars on the road in Havana are the 1950s American cars left on the island before the embargo. By photographing the landscape of Havana through the windshields of these vintage American cars, I wanted to evoke the way the United States was stuck in the politics of that time period with Cuba and to show that Cubans, no matter their opposition to the policies of the USA, are forced to see their own landscape through a distinctly American lens.
Okay, we've got a whole kind of a whole kind of beans there to open up conceptually and politically and
Yep.
everything else. Okay, right. Does he also, or did he also, when he was in Cuba or in New Mexico, does he also photograph people?
Oh, yeah, for
Okay,
sure.
okay. So here's one of the things that I think about landscape photography, and we may as well cause trouble, good trouble, from the beginning. Street photography requires a lack of connection with the people. It's very much the photography of the observer, of the
Mhm.
voyeur. Landscape photography, to me, is also the photography of the voyeur. Now, we could say that photography is voyeuristic. However, the moment you start to photograph people, some kind of a relationship begins with the people if they're aware that they're being photographed. So, is one of the reasons why landscape photography is so popular, particularly amongst hobbyists and enthusiasts, and the same with street photography, because it doesn't require that social interaction.
So that's really interesting, and I wonder about wildlife photography too. From that same perspective. Look, I was speaking with a photographer. I do consultations with photographers, and I was speaking with a photographer last week and she is terrific. She's so great, but um, she doesn't photograph a lot of people in the scenes that she takes. And we were talking about that, and she was like, you know what? I'm kind of an introvert. It makes me nervous to talk. And I get it. Like I totally get it. And I do think that it is. Um, easier to sit on the top of a mountain and take a sunset than to try to get somebody to pose for you or interact with you or collaborate with you on a picture, for sure.
Especially if you're going to treat it as a technical exercise, because it allows you to kind of bury yourself in the technique, in creation, but also in that post-production.
Right. Um,
However, the photographer you would, sorry, the photographer you're talking about there seems to me he's thinking conceptually, which is
he's
another
thinking,
add-on.
he's thinking very conceptually, but he's also thinking about the lived environment, and he's thinking about how people experience their environment. And I think when I read my next question and his next response, we can even go a level deeper because he addresses this in what I think is a quite a thoughtful way. I asked Alex, when you make landscape pictures, what elements must be present for you to press the shutter? Many of my landscape photographs amount to conversations with myself about photography and about seeing. I'm interested in making landscape photographs that are essentially about time and the impact of time. In fact, sometimes photographing the same landscape over time. For instance, when my daughter was 8 years old, she became fascinated by a huge anthill on our land in northern New Mexico. I photographed her next to the anthill at that time, and again when she was 14, standing in the same spot. Both she and the landscape had changed in fascinating ways. The anthill appeared largely the same. I am also drawn to the idea of the visual foil, one thing in relation to another, one element of a photograph enhancing the meaning of another element, helping to define it. So, for instance, I'm drawn to photograph aspects of the interior of a home where we can also see the landscape through the windows of that home, essentially seeing the landscape from inside the human constructed world looking out. When I'm successful, my landscape photographs evoke the life and history of particular individuals and families or of entire communities. If successful, over time, these landscapes become portraits of a culture.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so interiors photography is interior landscape photography.
So what he does, and you asked me if he shoots people. So
Mm.
when he was 22, and I think that was about 50 years ago, he moved to northern New Mexico, a small town, and started shooting the old people of this village, the ancianos. And from there, over some years, he started shooting the interiors of their homes and was hoping to make portraits of them without them being in it, in a way. And the pictures are in color and they are amazing. And then this additional element of shooting, of being able to see the landscape from the homes where they live, I also find truly fascinating.
I do as well, because what it's doing is you started off and you said something, and I instantly like, haha, pretty pictures. That idea of the photograph on the chocolate box, the landscape that isn't real, that
Mhm.
idea of the AI landscape. And that's being created without that additional thought, that additional understanding of why this work is actually being made and why it needs to exist. And every time you were talking about that work, I kept thinking of my mantra that photography is memory made history, which to me is the simplest way of talking about photography.
I mean, I guess I wonder, and hopefully we'll hear from some listeners who are more steeped in landscape photography than you and I are, and who actually practice it, which is what do they get from making a picture of a beautiful skyscape or mountain? It's very clear to me what photographer Alex Harris is getting and what he's interrogating and thinking about, and it is about people and the environment, and how they sort of live and work together. and how humans experience that environment.
But I
Um,
see. But is he? And this is where we go even deeper into the weeds. Is he a landscape photographer? Would he describe himself as a landscape photographer?
um, I don't know. I didn't ask him that. My sense is he would not. I mean,
Yeah.
he founded, at the university where he was a professor, he founded the sort of school or program of documentary photography, not landscape
So
photography.
what he's
So,
doing is documenting space and place.
that's right. Um, but I would be curious to know, and so it's clear to me what Alex is interested in when he clicks. It, um, it's a little less clear to me what the sort of enthusiast photographer is hoping to get when they make a picture and then quote unquote fix it up after the fact. Um,
But I can imagine, and again, I might be completely off here, but I can imagine the enthusiast seeing Alex's work and thinking, ah, I could do that in post-production. I could photograph the inside of a car and then I could drop in a view and I could do that in layers and turning something which is intrinsically human into something that is about sort of creating a poster.
yeah. Although I don't think the idea would strike them to
Well,
to
it would if they saw it and thought
if they
they're going to
thought they
copy
might.
it.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I have this joke about landscape photography, and I don't know if this will ring true with you. When I used to work on photography magazines, there were a whole load of editors of enthusiast photography magazines, and none of them had ever worked as photographers. None of
Mm.
them. And so what they were kind of doing was replicating their articles on what had previously been done. And one of them was what I called Misty Water, which was photographing water in a river or going over some rocks on a slow shutter speed, and it created misty water. And every month there would be an article about misty water. And it's that idea of photography as kind of copying
Mm.
rather than as leading.
Interesting. Um,
Do you know what I mean by misty water?
I do, 100%. I see it all the time. I
Yeah,
see it all the time.
yeah. So the mastering misty water is kind of the end goal for some, perhaps within the world of landscape.
Well, so interestingly, and I asked Alex, what are some of the common mistakes that you see landscape photographers make?
Yeah.
And he didn't mention Misty Water per se. He said, we all carry pictures with us in our minds about the way the world looks, memories of the way we've seen the landscape photographed. I believe our job as photographers is to try to get those pictures out of our heads or to recognize when we've been successful seeing the landscape in a way that is spontaneously or essentially our own.
Well, there you go.
There it is.
But he's not a landscape photographer. Who else
Right.
did you speak to, Bill?
Well, the next person I spoke with is a landscape photographer.
Okay.
Um, his name is Kit Young, and I've been a fan of Kit's work for some years, and finally was able to share a meal with him at last year's Perry Photo, which was great. He's a great, 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 great guy. Kit, who lives in Wyndham, Norfolk, which I gather is a couple of hours. Was it northeast of London?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Norfolk is yeah, just northeast of London. Yeah. And I know Wyndham very well.
so he is not only an incredible film photographer, but truly a master printer. And on his Instagram feed, which I love, he often talks about his approach and techniques. His work is represented by the Hewlett Gallery in Tulsa, Oklahoma, here in the States, and he's exhibited at various Leica galleries and beyond. And I really urge everybody to check out his work. So I asked Kit. Um, he shoots in black and white, by the way. I asked
Can
Kit.
I sorry, Bill, can I just ask you, how old is Kit?
Oh, I am gonna guess he is in his low to mid 30s, although I'm not
Okay.
100% sure.
Okay, young.
So yeah,
Okay.
he's certainly compared to me, he's young.
Because the photographer, I was just sorry again. I've just remembered the name of the photographer I was trying to remember,
Oh,
which is John Blakemore.
okay.
And in the UK, John Blakemore is an absolute kind of the pedigree. He sadly died recently, but he was the one who taught everybody how to print. If you went
Interesting.
and studied, sorry, do continue.
I mean, I do think people interested in printing should turn to Kit, and you'll see when I go through some of this. But his prints, which I have had the pleasure of seeing, are spectacular. Um, so I asked him, why do you make landscape photographs rather than working in any other genre? What draws you to the work? And he says, the landscape photography found me. After moving from Paris to Norfolk, England in 2013, I began exploring the local landscape. Norfolk is a flat country. Flat places, generally speaking, are difficult to look at. They have a history of not being loved. Perhaps it has something to do with the quote unquote bleakness, a word I don't like, and that an eye wandering over the landscape contours struggles to find a point of reference. It struggles to make sense of the space. I became fascinated with this and began obsessively exploring the myriad of local paths along local rivers, across boggy marsh, and through reed beds. Over time, I developed a deep affection for the landscape I explored on foot. I photographed it incessantly, and this outer landscape started to shape my inner landscape. The picture taking led to many years of refining the picture making part, spending thousands of hours in the darkroom trying to find a way of printing the work so that I could share what it was I saw in the landscape. Um, I guess for all photographers, negatives are the blueprint, but I was interested to see how I could take that blueprint, peel back the layers, and try to show something not as it appears in reality, whatever that is, but as I saw it. Indeed, with this landscape work, I seek not to make photographs which are documents packed with minute details, but which are instead impressions or evocations of a place.
Which exactly fits with what I was saying at the beginning, doesn't it? About that idea of landscape photography, that the image is the starting point for the production of the artifact, for
Yeah.
that printing and so forth.
Yeah, and I also like what he says that he is printing work so that quote I could share what it was I saw in the landscape, which is different from the landscape that I saw. Um,
Yeah,
it,
it is, and it's a very well Norfolk. I love the way you say it, but
oh, how am I supposed to say it?
well, it's Norfolk.
And what do I say?
I think
Norfolk?
you would say Norfolk, or
Yeah, like folk music. Yeah.
yeah, it's But then I'm a Londoner, so I'm not going to say it right. I'm not going to say it like somebody from Norfolk should say it. But
Norfolk.
it is very flat. It is very big sky, um, and it's very rural. Um, you know, so it is, and also it's got a real history of artists living there going back. So it is one of those kind of areas that encourages that kind of melancholic introspection, I would say. I don't know if that describes his work.
Um, I don't know. I'd love to hear how he describes it. He's got one picture of his which I am absolutely crazy for. It is a picture of a mountain rising, and it's like I said, it's black and white, and it's there's beautiful tones. But the first time I saw it, I thought it was a gigantic wave. Um, and so, every time I look at it, it goes back and forth for me. Is it a wave? Is it a mountain? What am I looking at? And there's this sense of um, instability that I get as the viewer, not knowing what I'm looking at, but being in love with it. And I think he's done a really interesting job because my sense is especially after hearing him talk about it, that must be something of what he felt when he made the picture. Um,
Yeah, well, it certainly won't be in Norfolk if it's a mountain, that's for sure.
no, I
Um,
think it's not.
but
Um,
it's interesting though that you're talking about an emotional attachment, an emotional reaction to his work. So there we go. I mean, that's where we started at the beginning when you were saying, you know, I don't really feel that connection with landscape photography because I don't get that emotional, but you do get it from his work. So I wonder what he's doing differently to the majority of the stuff we see.
I do get it from his work. Now, I think it might be worth just for 1 second um, going back to the famous photograph that Ansel Adams took called Moonrise Hernandez, Mexico,
Mm.
which probably everybody knows. But it's black and white. There's a moon in the sky. There's clouds in the sky. Um, and there's this sort of small town and maybe some graves, in the foreground or middle ground. And to me, that is a beautiful picture. It is a landscape, it is a moonscape, and it is a townscape all in one.
But that's also interesting because that is that a documentation of a town? What makes that landscape photography? This, I think the moment you and I start to talk about photography, we very quickly realize why we're so against labels.
Right. Yeah.
Because what is that? What is I hate this idea of landscape photography. I think that's what no, I'm going to come out with it. What the hell is it? I mean, if we go back to landscape painting, and we go back to the classical approaches of landscape painting, and quite often in that landscape painting, there might be some people with a cart bringing in the hay if it's constable, or there might be a ship on fire if it's a turner, or there's always other elements within that, which it's not just nature, but quite often
Right.
the work we're talking about, I think, is just nature.
I
Is that
think,
right? Am I right?
yeah, I think that might be right. Um, I asked Kit, I said, what do you look for? What elements must be present when you press the shutter? And he said, I think with the landscape work I make, both locally and in places farther afield, like Scotland and the Dolomites in Italy, I seek to explore the inner light of my subject matter. By inner light, I mean the light that seems to emerge from objects rather than fall on them. A light that is like a conversation between things, a light that is the possession of the landscape, invariably radiating skyward. There's obviously a balancing act thing at play when I'm making the work. Camera in hand, I'm responding to the light, lines, shape, and tones of what is in front of me. I don't give it any more thought than that. I must work quickly and instinctively. Too much thought results in the thing that initially piqued my interest fizzling away. It's all very instinctive. It has to be. But once the picture has been taken, I generally see the photograph and any worth it may have for the first time on the contact sheet. Negative in hand, I'm able to recall the exact moment I made the exposure. So even though I'm in my darkroom, my mind is back in the landscape and I'm able to recall what it was I felt when tripping the shutter. Then begins the hours, weeks, months, sometimes years of working to find ways to translate that feeling to paper. I think if I have any yes, yes, yes or eureka moments, they invariably take place in the dark room under red light.
Okay, I've got two questions. One question's about Kit and the other's about you. The first question is he working large format?
Um, I believe he shoots with a Leica, but I don't know what he shoots with. I can find out.
Okay, so that would be interesting. If he's shooting with a Leica, which is not the normal kind of camera for that kind of work, I think that's interesting.
I
But
could be mistaken about that. I could be mistaken.
okay, um, my second question is when you're looking at photography, what are you looking for that makes that connection?
I look for something that makes me feel something. Um, that's always been what it is for me. I'm less interested in being informed or shown than I am in the emotional response that I get.
So on that basis, and I started off, I'm feeling like an inquisitor this month. I don't know why. I'm obviously in that mood. Um, I wonder if that mountain picture makes a connection with you because of personal history
Hmm.
rather than anything else. There's a photograph by photographer Neil McDermott. He did a photograph quite high up, and it's of railway tracks in East Croydon in southeast London, which I used to go through all the time, going into London. And it's a gritty urban landscape, which reminded me of a kind of Turner painting. But it connected with me because of my personal connection with that area. And I'm wondering if the mountain connected with you in that way.
Well, so I think that's an interesting point. I don't think the mountain in Kit's picture hits me that way. But the fact that I see the mountain as a wave, that does. Because
Yeah.
I grew up essentially in the ocean. You know, I was a surfer kid and spent all my time searching for waves. And so that speaks to me. And this picture behind me that Alex took through the windshield at the Black Mesa in New Mexico speaks to me because I live here now and I see these mountains and mesas all the time. So I think, yeah. But conversely, what do I get from Misty Water? I don't know.
Well, I don't think you get anything from
Right. Well, I don't.
no,
I
but I
don't.
think that's maybe why it's such an interesting area for us to talk about because actually, as always, as outsiders for that, we're that much more questioning, perhaps, of those practices.
Yep. Um, my last question for Kit was, what are some of the common mistakes you see landscape photographers make? Um, Probably the biggest mistake we make is to label the work landscape photography. I think the most interesting photographs show a given photographer's personal experience and relationship with place and how that place, an outer landscape, has shaped their inner landscape.
I have to say to listeners and viewers, Bill and I do not confer at all about what's going to be said and who he's spoken to. So it may seem as if we've set this up to try and make ourselves sound clever, but that really isn't the case at all, is it?
It's not, and if we sound clever, I would be shocked. But
It would
be
be a
that
mistake.
right. Um, the last photographer I spoke with is probably a little bit more what you think of when you think of a landscape photographer, to the extent that I've seen his work, and I have, but I haven't gone through his archive. You know, it's not conceptual like Alex's. There aren't people in it. Um, he shoots in color. His name is Geraint Smith, and he is a truly exceptional photographer who lives not far from me, also here in New Mexico. I fell for his pictures because living near each other, we see the same things. And he's the only photographer that I've found who captures how these scenes and moments of like glorious light actually make me feel. His work has appeared in a million magazines and for a million clients, and he leads personal photo tours and workshops in New Mexico and Colorado. So I asked Geraint, why do you make landscape photographs rather than working in any other genre? What draws you to the work? And his response was very personal. He said, all my life, I've spent more time outdoors than indoors, hiking, camping, backpacking. In those early years, I wasn't documenting very much at all. I have no photographs to show, only memories. I grew up in England and Wales and was drawn to the cinema and especially to Westerns. Those wide open American landscapes left a lasting impression. Over time, the visual and love for the outdoors ultimately led me to the American Southwest. Landscape photography became a way um, to continue what I'd always done, exploring, wandering, being outside, but now with a camera. It's not just about capturing scenery. It's about documenting a lifelong relationship with wild spaces shaped by my childhood in the outdoors and cinematic dreams. So what I like about that, you know, you asked me, do I have a connection with the mountain in Kit's photograph? Um, what this photographer Geraint is doing is he is shooting things that very personally speak to his um, inner self and past life.
Yeah, but is he about my age?
Um, well,
Late,
you and I are the same age. I believe he's a smidge older than we are,
yeah,
but I'm not
maybe kind of late
100%.
90s, late 60s. And growing up in England at that time, cowboys, westerns were on television. There wasn't a lot else on other than war films.
Mm.
Um, and it was incredibly glamorous. And it was such a world away from the world we lived in. So I completely understand his kind of sense of awe and wonder around that. But again, all three photographers, I think Kit to me sounds most like what I would perceive to be a traditional landscape photographer. However, all three of them are coming at it from my perception here as from such a personal perspective, such a deep connection that actually it's got nothing to do with landscape. If it's any landscape, it's their internal landscape that they're kind of reflecting in the work.
Yeah, I mean, they feel psychological in a way.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Which isn't something that so although the three photographers you've spoken about are dealing with rural kind of understandings of landscape, and I really think we should do another episode where we talk about urban landscape because I
mm,
think that opens up a whole new kind of way of looking and thinking. But it's very personal to them. They aren't doing that thing that you and I spoke about at the beginning of treating landscape photography as a kind of technical exercise.
no, Kit in his um, printing, developing, is very technically oriented. And as he told us, he sort of finds the photo in the darkroom
Yeah,
rather than in the moment.
yeah.
But I think that's more of the psychological exploration in a way.
So I wonder who Kit's heroes are.
Well,
Uh,
we can find out.
Yeah, do you have them there, or is this something we need to ask him?
No, I need to ask him.
Okay.
I need to ask him about that and what camera he uses. Um, so I asked one more. I asked another question to Geraint. What do you look for? What elements must be present when you press the shutter? For me, he said, photography begins with connection, an intuitive emotional bond with the landscape. Before I ever press the shutter, I immerse myself in the environment, allowing it to reveal something more than what first meets the eye. I often sit quietly, sometimes in a chair, observing, waiting, not just for the light to change, but for the feeling of the place to come into focus. Many of my images come from sudden reactions, those, oh my God, look at that moments that stop you in your tracks. But even then, they come from a place of presence. I don't chase scenes, I let them unfold. I trust in patience, instinct, and an awareness of what surrounds me. My goal is not only to show what a landscape looks like, but to express what it feels like, to share a moment of awe, stillness, or quiet as I experienced it.
So I want to know the photographers that these guys look up to because
Yeah.
I don't, and I'd also love to know whether or not this is your challenge if you wish to accept it, Bill. I'd love to know what the influence is on them of painting,
Mm.
of you know, from artists because I just see such a connection as I often do with portrait photography, with portrait painting, between landscape and painting and photography, because the basis or the foundation of creative kind of making is in the showing of landscape.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if you go right back to cave drawings and they're painting on the landscape itself and making marks on the landscape. So there's such a rich tradition there that it makes a lot of sense, but maybe a little bit like street photography. It's been given a bad name by people thinking it's easy and going about it from the wrong perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And it gets back to the labels, but I feel like um, these photographers um, are shooting interior scapes, of their emotions and spirit and psychology and soul, that just happens to be projected onto the land in front of them, in a way. And I think that's what gives them these pictures their depth and why they connect with me.
So
Um,
since you moved to Bills, I'm going to ask you another question. I never
okay.
ask you questions, so this time I'm asking you loads. When you moved from Brooklyn to New Mexico, did your photography change? The photography you make?
Well, it did, and just to be clear to everybody who's listening, I do not consider myself a photographer. I take pictures, but I don't consider myself we can talk about that at some other point. But, in Brooklyn, what you see all the time are people on the streets. That's what's ever present. That's what's exciting and thrilling. Where I live now, you can't do quote unquote street photography. You just can't. And what's ever present and imposing and glorious and constantly surprising is the environment and the light on the environment. And so yeah, I didn't take any sunset pictures, during my time in Brooklyn, um, unless the sunlight happened to fall on somebody who was drunk and fallen on the ground. Um, Here, it's a completely different. It's completely different.
So that place and space thing is also important to the viewer as well as it is to the maker, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
I'm sure
for
your
sure.
appreciation of that work has changed also.
Yeah, absolutely. I asked what are some of the common mistakes that he sees landscape photographers make, and Geraint said one of the biggest mistakes is getting too caught up in technique, obsessing over settings, formulas, and chasing quote unquote the perfect shot, and missing the moment itself. There's a kind of blindness that comes from always trying to control the outcome. Also, being unprepared, whether it's not having gear ready, especially for fleeting wildlife opportunities, or not being patient enough to wait for the scene to reveal something unexpected. And then there's the temptation to copy what's already been done instead of interpreting the landscape through your own eyes. A technically perfect image without connection won't resonate. The most important thing is to stay open, stay curious, and trust your own vision. Familiarity with the landscape helps tremendously. It's my home, and I know it very well. Um, he said one more thing, which I want to add to that. He said, "I use the camera not just to record the landscape, but to see it more deeply. I try to capture the emotion, the contrasts. It's about translating what I felt in that moment into something others can feel too." So
That's a
there's a
very
lot there.
there is a lot there, but that's a very nice way to end it because I feel as if we've kind of come full circle, and Geraint's given us our manifesto.
He certainly has.
Listen, Bill, we don't know anything about landscape photography, and we're not that interested in it. But boy, I think we've begun an interesting conversation.
I have, and I would really love to hear from listeners who know more than we do, who practice the kind of landscape photography that I think you and I might have. I don't know if we've poo-pooed it a little bit, but that isn't as interesting to us because I know there are different perspectives here, and I would really like um, to hear what they are to certainly inform myself. So we'll put the Instagram handles for these three photographers on the site on your site. Maybe we'll have a couple of their pictures, but I'd also really love to hear from listeners.
Me too, because there is no right or wrong. We're not right or wrong, are we, Bill? We just kind of shoot the breeze every month and hopefully try and get people listening and viewing to kind of think about what they're doing. That's the only reason for why we do the thing, apart from also catching up and sharing each other's thoughts. So I think that would be really good. I'd love to hear from people making photographs of Misty Water. Please tell me why you do it and what you get from it. That would be
And
great.
also what I'm missing from Misty
Yeah,
Water.
Me too.
Because I really want to know what I'm not seeing or what I'm glossing over. I'm sure there's more than I'm catching, and I'd love to know.
I agree. You can get in touch with Bill through his Instagram, which is Bill.
At Bill Shapiro.
And you can get in touch with us, of course, all through the normal platforms at UN of Photo, and that includes Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, or through the website, unitednationsofphotography.com. Drop me an email. Bill, it's been a pleasure. I think next month we might go urban landscape. What do you think?
I'm in.
Let's do it. Take care.
Okay, bye, Grant.